What if the most useful AI isn't an agent doing things for you, but a companion that helps you stay with the things you actually want to do yourself? Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, hosted by Igor Schwartzman and me, Johannes Kleske. Follow the Rabbit is the podcast where we decode cultural phenomena and explore emerging trends to help you update your mental models of the world. In this episode, Igor shares how he built an AI companion to help him learn photography. Not something that edits his photos or automates his workflow, but something that helps him stick with the practice. We explore why this distinction matters, what it reveals about choice overload in our lives, and whether building personal tools to deal with systemic problems is part of the solution or part of the fragmentation. Let's dive in. So, it was only a matter of time. We made it to 1.5 years. If you follow Igor on Instagram, it's impossible to have not noticed that Igor got a camera. I'm trying hard not to make any jokes at this place about midlife crisis and stuff like that. But
I didn't buy a road bike or anything like that.
I mean, it's like you can buy the road bike, you can run a marathon, you can get a very expensive espresso machine. You choose the creative outlet, which I find really interesting, especially because I've seen so many of my friends get seduced by cameras and then instantly become nerds. And it's not able to talk to them anymore without talking about aperture and all those specificities. But you did something really interesting that we want to dig into a bit today. You created what I understand is a Claude project. So a project inside of Claude, the chatbot LLM system from Anthropic, that you've described to me as like a mini companion that helps you to get, I'd say, acquainted with your camera, how it works, how to take better pictures, and actually really have a companion that comes along for your learning journey of how to use your camera and take better pictures. Tell me about this. How does that work? Why did you do it? How did you came up with the idea? How did you set it up? All of those details.
Well, I mean, I think like I'm allowed 1 minute of explaining why it came to the camera in the first place. Like why this particular form of midlife crisis, I guess. And to kind of like to circle back to an episode that a couple of people have reached out to us about it, and because they appreciated it so much, is the episode with Christy George, talking about the emergence of curiosity and establishing a practice. And that, my conversation with Christy before we recorded the episode and since that episode, there is something lingered in the back of my head about having my own practice, my artistic practice, although it's still very cringy for me to even say it like that and not use quotation marks.
Just say practice.
Exactly. It's just a practice. And so I really kept thinking about this. And what I realized is that photography is something that is very kind of dear to me since I was a kid, because my dad was a photographer as well. Like cameras were always kind of a thing. And the last real camera, not the iPhone, although the iPhone is, people take have great photography practices with the iPhone. It's not about a device. Just kind of as a disclaimer, you don't need an actual camera to have a photography practice. That being said, I felt that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what I can do, and I bought myself. It's not a professional camera, but it is certainly like not, like entry point camera that you can do a lot of things with it. And one thing that I know about myself is that I'm not a person that will kind of sit down with a photography book and kind of read it cover to cover to understand all the basics.
Just quickly, like also what came to mind listening to you, there's also just the act of buying a camera in 2025 that
Yeah.
is in itself interesting, like, because you mentioned the iPhone, like, and there's and how good those camera systems are and how much you can take them, and there's always the notion of the best camera is the one you always have with you and stuff like that. So I think it's in itself also interesting. It also feels like somehow a part that came out of like all these conversations about like the physical things and the more dedicated thing, and escaping from the doom machine that always traps
Exactly.
you when you just want to do something simple, and then you 20 notifications in, you forgot what you wanted to do. So I also see that as like one like reaction
Oh,
to
yeah,
the
yeah.
current zeitgeist.
100%. Funny thing. If I may speak a little bit about the camera then, because it actually, so
Yes.
I bought a Fujifilm camera, and that in itself is already kind of, it's a very, like from the outside, it's a very basic, almost old school kind of device. Some people can say it's the Leica for poor people, although nothing about it is really cheap. But it's it's kind of, it's a analog, um, it's a skeuomorph, kind of like aesthetic, to a choice of camera. It could very much be like an analog camera from when you're looking straight at it. And funny enough, a close friend of this podcast, shout out to Jens, bought the exactly same camera 2 weeks before me without me knowing about it,
Oh,
which is kind of a
that's
little bit,
crazy.
that's kind of a little bit uncanny. And one of the motivations here is definitely to not have your phone with, like, not look at your phone 100%. Like I just know it about myself. It's just distracting. My mind goes somewhere else. But it's also like capturing, you know, you put money into it and it sounds cheap, but it does work. Kind of like, at least it does for me. Like you kind of like commit something. And yes, the best camera is the one that you have with you. And to the annoyance of my family, I now have my camera everywhere with me, which is, I think, also just a necessary way to kind of commit yourself to a practice and go beyond the awkwardness of suddenly being the person who kind of carries a camera with with them everywhere. Because really, about the camera, that's the only way how to get into it. We
Sure.
digressed a little bit. Let's kind of move back to this whole idea of what is it exactly that I did there with thought. So knowing myself and knowing how I learn, I was very clear that I'm not going to look up all this terminology. I'm not gonna kind of like dive right away and first of all spend a week configuring the camera to the best possible way. I learn by doing things, but that also prevents me sometimes from reaching that next step because I don't acquaint myself enough with the necessary terminology or the relationship between certain kind of functions. And that creates just the stagnation that people, I think, know from any kind of, practice or sports activity, where you can start pretty easily with everything, but kind of elevating your game requires a certain form of process that is often, at least in photography, quite dry still, because you kind of need to learn about how aperture and all of those kind of like technical terms relate to each other. And so, knowing myself and knowing also from my previous experience of having a camera, and also being very familiar with AI tools, I decided that I wanted to help myself by creating this project. At first, it's just a project inside of my Claude desktop. And what it kind of knows about me is, A, it has the manual to my camera. B, it kind of like knows what kind of lenses I have. Yes, two, not one. Um, and and it also knows through an iterative kind of conversation, what am I trying to achieve? So I know that I want to learn about a specific style of photography, and this is how I interact with it. And it was actually so well constructed right away that we quite easily arrived at that point that I might need a different lens from the one that I bought,
Mhm.
um, which would suit more the kind of things that I want to do. And so, what is different, I think to establish this distinction, what is an agent and what is the kind of companion thing? And there is like so much talk about AI agents, and I don't think I think if you know both of us, you kind of we use a lot of AI, but there is like this whole agent thing. It's just a little bit silly and overextended. But what is interesting about this companion idea is that instead of delegating something to a machine to do something for you, because I'm gonna exaggerate a little bit and say because it's beneath me, um, to dedicate to that task my full attention. Um, I basically created a machine that helps me stay with something.
Mm.
And I think that's an interesting space to explore because what we kind of crave in society is actually dedication and commitment and having someone or something um, help us guide us through this process of um, staying with the things that are actually important instead of just delegating everything to something else.
Mm. Can you give me like just this very practical example? Like, how do you use this companion? Like, just
Yeah.
one like example from your day or in the life of a
Yeah.
camera
So
enthusiast now.
yeah. Well, I mean, I try to take basically like, oh, I mean, that's kind of fairly common practice. I try to take a couple of photos every day. Even on a rainy, shitty day, I still need to walk the dog. So I kind of like take the camera with me and I try to kind of find a space and time to kind of take at least some photos. And I share them with, in the chat, with that camera assistant or whatever camera companion. And instead of, I mean, obviously AI systems are eager to please you and kind of like discuss with you aesthetics. I'm not interested in this discussion of the aesthetics, but what is interesting is that if you kind of train it the right way, it will focus on things that are super technical about a photo because you can share a photo and, for example, the EXIF file, which is like the um, every JPEG has this kind of metadata file that describes what kind of what kind of camera you use, what kind of lens you use. It has all this kind of data, and through that data, the machine can kind of like, oh, listen, if you would have changed that, it would have resulted in that. Like it basically gives me a better understanding, and I noticed this now myself because now I'm kind of more freely jumping between settings um, because I have this immediate kind of way of learning,
Mhm.
both because I see obviously the photos, but because my eye is being trained by this very patient, like I like to think about them like almost like a Buddhist monk kind of like coach that is very patient with you and
Mm.
is never judgmental, never kind of like pushing you too hard either, but kind of giving you look, your eye should be focusing on that detail or on that thing, or you should not try to create like, for example, it said me, don't focus on creating pre-selects.
Mhm.
Focus on just not fumbling around too much with the settings, so that you kind of like. So that's the kind of thing that I do with.
Do you sometimes just like do also like experiments of learning where you say, I'm just gonna use like different apertures to see the difference and to learn about that? And actually, but I think what I find interesting always with these AI companions is that they take a process that I could do myself. Like you could just like look at all the details and settings of a picture in like Lightroom or a tool like that, and just okay, this was this, and then see it side by side and stuff like that. But you would have to do it all in your head to a certain extent. How much of your learning process is also about like just getting it out of your head and have somebody who's not going crazy right away to help you reflect on what did you just do, and also be able to play back to you like, oh, you always seem to like those pictures of you that use a certain setting or something like that.
Yeah, it's for sure like that. So, I mean, not that I stick to them like in a very kind of like stringent way, but like one of the things that came out of that is to stick with one lens, like the one that I bought afterwards, and basically just say, okay, let's focus on developing your skills without thinking, oh, it would be nice to switch to a different lens right now. Because what you want is to kind of like be very familiar with one instrument and then focus on changing and like finding out where the limits are, um, of that photo. And now, like, not that I'm like I didn't have that much time, but at the same time I do, as I said, like carry the camera every day with me everywhere. And I take photos, and I'm, like, one other thing that I really enjoyed this year is like talking to very different people across, almost 70 interviews that I did. And I decided, for example, that I want to use the camera to learn how to approach people that I don't know, um, and ask them if it's okay to take a photo of them. And my thing is like to talk to kind of like food people, like chefs or anything like that. And it really, like, it's just like I have this thing now. Like I might as well kind of get up and kind of ask someone if it's okay to take a photo of them. And it kind of like it guided me to learn how to do that. Like, how do you approach someone with a camera? Like, how do you kind of like what are the also like body gestures that you can do if someone is on the other side of the street? So a lot of those things, I don't think it's necessary to use AI for that. Not at all. Like, as you said, you can kind of look at the data on your thing, but it's like, and for some people, the book or the analog kind of like way of learning, that's their thing. I'm not saying that should be like a universal approach, but for people who learn differently, like I do, or in other ways, this AI companion can have this. Um, it's not the same thing as an experienced photography tutor, but it is always there.
Yeah. So I think it's easy to imagine a lot of other contexts where you can uses this sort of a companion for his coffee brewing nerdism, I would call it.
Are we not going to? No, we don't.
No,
We don't.
no,
Yeah.
no. So so this is an example where you can just like put in a lot of like, I like this coffee, I like this brewing. What could I try here? What could I try there? What should I expect when I do this, when I do that? So there's a lot of like this companion thing works in a lot of contexts. So what do you think? And if you reflect your own usage of your companion, why does it work and what does it feel like?
I think we should point out that this brand that we're not going to out. What is interesting to me is that he arrived at building that kind of companion all by himself,
Hmm.
about the same time. And I think from a design perspective or from a product perspective, there is this. And I mean, we worked on our first really big kind of like Gen AI synthetic media project was this a report that we did for Germany's largest public broadcaster, and where we created 4 scenarios that were aligned across an axis that said automation and augmentation. And I think like automation for me, like I'm oversimplifying now, but automation always kind of ends up on the efficiency gains problem. Like you can
Mhm.
put a lot of money into automating existing tasks, and it will generate um, it will generate efficiency. But the question is efficiency the only point? And I think from a design perspective, there's just too little attention to what those systems are enabling us to do by augmenting our skills and creating things that would not be otherwise possible. So I would not otherwise have a camera assistant, much, and I would, our friend would not have a brewing companion, because the effort that he would have needed to put into them, to actually create them would not be like, it's just like, I don't know, like it reminds me a lot of those early days, IFTTT, or using different software to automate things on your Mac and all of that stuff. And a lot of it was kind of useful, but when you kind of at the end of the day, the effort you put in to creating those automations would result in, and you would need to like use that automation for like 5 years to kind of make up for the time that you put into creating them. Now it's different, and I think that's the really interesting part, that what we can now create is those micro solutions for companions that are very tailored to our ability to stick with something. So I think for me it was who's having the agency in that kind of like relationship. And I think the agency is still with me
Yeah.
because I put some of my agency into that thing so that it kind of keeps me focused on what I kind of wanted to do. Like, and I think a lot of those practices and a lot of those kind of companions that I assume a lot of other people are also building for themselves, um, will have some of that. It's like this. Maybe it's a really bad time to become a coach. That's all I'm saying.
But if you zoom out from that and you see, oh, so we have this friend who has done very similar to you, just completely on his own. I myself have certainly different companions that are there, and we hear it from others. We see this usage right here, right now. We have a lot of discussion about, as you say, AI as coach and therapists, and all of these. Like, we have certain aspects that it's interesting to talk to something, to have like a more like guided approach, to have the ability. I find it interesting, like what you described before, where it feels like it's a combination of a notebook, but that can also has a lot of like intelligence in the sense of knowing things behind that. Like if you say, I want to use it to approach people, it can say, oh, here, let me find some good patterns or best practices to actually do this kind of thing. So it can really keep you in the flow of learning by giving you what you're interested in at the moment. But nevertheless, there seems to be a big demand in these kind of things. If you zoom out, what do you think? Why now? Where does that come from?
Well, I think one, and that doesn't have to do anything with AI in general. I think we are just surrounded by too much choice.
Yeah.
And one
There you
of
go.
the things that what we are, so I think what happened kind of, if you play down that road to hyper individualism, what it actually just creates is that we are confronted with, the necessity to constantly make decisions. We are both making very banal decisions in terms of should I eat this or that. Although even that is not banal anymore, because we're constantly kind of bombarded with both health related and ecological kind of like reasons of why eating that or not that, and just the fact that you don't know creates cognitive load. And so I agree with John's point about cognitive depth. But the question is, if you choose between cognitive load, like lowering your cognitive load by creating cognitive depth, I'm not sure
That's
that
interesting.
cognitive depth will actually win, because people will always choose to lower cognitive load, at least right now, because we're so confronted with decision making that was outsourced to us at a just an extraordinary kind of amount. And it used to be, and the reason is that when everyone is using the same playbook, you kind of arrive at the same thing, that everyone is trying to be like, well, it's up to you. Like you can like make any choice you want. And if everything is using that playbook, every service, every product, every like it just like what the fuck? Like I just need
Yeah.
something that will take away my decision making. But, and I think, like on a political level, we're seeing a lot of that as well. Like people are just like, I don't know. This is all very frustrating, very confusing. Let's elect someone who pretends to have a very simple but wrong kind of answer to a very
Yeah.
complex problem.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, like a couple of years ago, Netflix experimented already with this idea of just kind of using the "I'm feeling lucky" button from Google
Yeah.
on Netflix, where it would just kind of just play something, because people would sit there, browse for like 45 minutes through the optionality of Netflix, and then actually not watch anything. And that's a problem, obviously, long term. And so I think for me, I know that without this thing, I would have probably bought this camera. It would have been probably a thing of 2 months where my attention would have stuck with it for the most part. I would have stagnated at some point, and then it would kind of like lie in the corner. Well, I'm 1 month in, so let's see where it goes, I guess. Um, I'm trying to be like as transparent as possible, but I think what is interesting about this is that we can create tools that are helping us stick with things that we really want, when we have the ability to delegate that to a machine, so that we can get the assistance that we want to stick with the things that we really want to or need to.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important part.
For me, it's really the fascinating thing here is that we are now a couple of years into this experience with Gen AI, and although there is still like crazy overhyped narratives out there, we also can have a much more like hands-on experience with it, and can be much more detailed and specific in our approaches. And I think these ideas of companions is a really interesting aspect of that, because there's also still the idea that out there, if you watch like a typical keynote or demo of OpenAI or Anthropic or Perplexity, it's all about like the cases are always like cringy as fuck, because they always like, oh, you want to do a weekend trip, and then it finds you the cheapest tickets and stuff like that. And I think that's a perfect example of why the companion makes so much sense, because they all think of it, oh, it's agentic, it does its own thing. But this is not how we function as humans. Like, you don't go out there and just like, get me the cheapest fly and book it for me. You want to like give me some options, and then I'm going to figure out like this whole process of how we book our holidays and things like that. It's part of the process. Like, we want to know, we want to understand, and we want to find the surprising thing by serendipity that we didn't even think about, but that fits perfectly and stuff like that. And that's why I think, or that's just what came to mind listening to you, is this is why the companion that comes along, that helps us to, that we give some agency, but that doesn't take away agency from us like an agent does, or the concept of an agent does, because we want to actually we want to make the decision, but we need help to not be overwhelmed by the opportunities. Because we have so much opportunities and options in our daily life that we basically freeze. And these companions help us to say, okay, here's just something. Let's roll with this. And then you're like, okay, that basically make the first step for you. And then you can roll with that. And then you have a lot of other possibilities to shape it and to say, oh, let's go deeper into that, or I don't want this, let's go over here. But they help you to make the first step to overcome like decision fatigue. And that's why I find the whole process so fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I think, opportunity or optionality at too high amount, it always kind of results like, economists know about this quite well. It's like if you have too much optionality, it actually has a negative effect on decision making. And in psychology, there's like enough studies out there actually that are looking into that. One of the reasons why so many people are adopting AI is exactly that. Like it's the wish of consciously delegating responsibility. Now, I think there is still a problem in that, obviously, because to fully be able to understand what you're delegating to, you need a certain amount of literacy about those systems that most people who are probably delegating a lot of that I do not have about those specific companies. But what is interesting about companions, and to kind of give very concrete examples. Well, first off, I asked, for example, this friend in the chat that we're having together, that friend who made a coffee companion, to share his file with me. And when I say file is, I will kind of just briefly kind of explain. So most of those AI systems really like an archaic kind of like text file that's called Markdown. And it's been around for like 20 years, but for the most part, it was used just by nerds. I'm not looking at anyone here.
I don't know what you mean with my 3,000 Markdown files in my Obsidian vault. No idea.
But now it's kind of like the file system that kind of underpins a lot of those AI systems, because AI systems really like very simple text documents, but that are still formatted. And that's where Markdown came in, because compared to just a normal text file, it's a formatting language as well. And so hence the popularity. And so if you use Claude, you kind of probably experience at one point or another this ability to download what it created, and it downloads it as a Markdown file. You can add that Markdown file to your project knowledge. You can do all kinds of things with it. But the interesting part is it's not a proprietary system, right? Like, so you can kind of just take that thing and give it to someone else. And so what I did is took that friend's Markdown file, changed all the things that he had about his specific setup. I added kind of my coffee machine, my coffee grinder, my preferences to coffee. And now I have my version of that companion on my system. And I think an additional point, which is, I think, obviously not widely used, but I think that might also change over time, is the fact that for this kind of companionship, you don't need the best AI system in the world. It's also like, I don't know, in German, one would say mit Kanonen auf Spatzen, because it's so specific. It can probably run on a very kind of like low intensity, like lower setting on a smaller a language model. It can probably run an open source model, and I think what's kind of interesting is that proposition for me as well, like the fact that we can share those companions with others, or create a marketplace for those small companions that are solving highly specific things. So I don't know, like it's an interesting proposition. When thinking about creating tools with AI that are not automating, but really augmenting. And I think, like, specifically what I find fascinating, also based on our conversation today, is this idea of choice making. Like, it's really about committing to something and designing a system for us that helps us, you know, follow through on our commitments. Like, it helps us capture that moment of excitement and being like, oh, I'm like, this is what I really want to do. Help me, or let me dramatize a little bit. It like basically protects us from distraction. Like, it's just kind of like it's there to help me not make another choice. It helps me uh to it. Yeah, I guess like in a way it's like a protector against other distractions.
Yeah, I think that's one part, but I'm also fascinated by the idea of us being able to share these like markdown files. And I mean, it used to be that everything was about the prompt, and
Yeah.
you would just share prompts. But this year, the conversation about how to best use these chatbots connected to LLMs is much more. It's about the context. Like the context you give plays a
Yeah.
much bigger role than, because they're pretty good at interpreting prompts, so you don't have to be too specific anymore with the prompts, but because the context is so important. So, and now that also in this case Claude has the memory feature that learns from the stuff and actually has a way for you to access that memory and understand everything it has learned from the conversation with you about using your camera. You have these these text files that you can use, and they basically feed into the same idea than the companion itself. It makes it easier to start, because I think a
Yeah.
lot of the problem with too many options is that even if you choose an option, how do you start? What's the first step? And then if you say, oh, I want to do this, but I don't have to start at zero. I can take a companion setup markdown file from somebody else, and I can use it for my own. I can just throw it into Claude and say, hey, this is from a friend. Let's adapt this to my context. Help me, ask me a lot of questions to make sure that everything is in there that I really like. And all of a sudden I have my own file, but this is how I start. I mean, it's the same thing how I've a couple of months ago shared a prompt that I use or in a sort of companion for like a morning check-in. So it's just like where I
Yeah.
say I could like there's like the typical morning pages method where you just sit down and write three pages of whatever comes to mind. And for me, that always felt like I have to to get started. Like, oh, where am I in my head? It's always a bit difficult. For me, it's always easier to answer questions than to just start with a blank page. And so I just developed this prompt that and some context for it that just ask me questions in the mornings. Just start like, how do you feel? Like, where's your head at? How does your body feel? Like, oh, is it this and this? Like, okay, tell me more about this. Tell me more about that. It just helps me to get started, to get somewhere. And I'm always kind of fascinated after like 20 minutes. I look at it like I had no idea what end up at this point about my day when I started this, because it step by step with and Claude has no idea, because it just asks me questions, but they trigger something in my mind, and it helps me to get over the barrier. And so I think this is one of those super helpful things. It helps you to get started. It helps you to not start with a blank page or with zero. And this is why I think it's really interesting that we now have the opportunity or the possibility to share these things around, learn from others. Because honestly, anything I've learned about how to use chatbots with large language models is from seeing how others are using them and trying out prompts and things like that. I'm really curious to see if this even becomes even more a thing of much more people like putting their markdown files on GitHub or even selling them on these like content creation platforms or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think like I think there's a lot of it is, like just very common for software developers because so much of it lives from the fact that people are just sharing their knowledge because that's how software, even closed one, is being kind of developed. A lot of it is just being shared. And I think it's kind of interesting to adapt mechanics that work for software development to non-software development contexts. And we are seeing that in other areas as well. What I do, I think, I'm genuinely excited about this, and I'm genuinely excited about just kind of just ability to just share a text document without kind of like having to install a full system. But at the same time, I think we would not. I think it's important to also point out that obviously one question kind of goes through my mind is this contributing to another form of fragmentation?
Mhm.
It's all the solution to the fact that we have too much choice is a system that is built because we have too much choice in a way. And so you kind of following that rabbit hole kind of very, very into the depth of it all by creating even smaller and smaller kind of systems that are tuned to an individual. And so I would definitely say that there is a problem, it's a systemic problem that we definitely probably exasperating by doing that. But I think an important aspect about this is that it still creates awareness of how, what is happening in society right now in terms of being overwhelmed with decision making. And I think, individuals have to figure out how to make and to go through the day and find kind of new ways of helping themselves to deal with the realities. I think there's just also, and uh, we discussed this and before the podcast, there's this new feature, not that I personally would use ChatGPT for that, but there's this new feature being discussed that ChatGPT is now allowing multiple people to chat in one chat. And I think that's kind of also pointing towards a direction where your financial advisor and you can discuss something in one chat to understand this better, but your health advisor, your medical practitioners, your therapist, have those systems can then become kind of this unifying kind of a place where both highly human expertise and machine assistance come together. Now, do I wish that those systems are controlled by companies like OpenAI or Anthropic? No, I don't. And I'm, trying a lot of things to use as much open LLMs as possible. But that being said, I think it's still kind of pointing us toward interesting products that people can be designing, towards just this need in society to find new ways of dealing with everyday things and sticking to the things that we really want to do instead of just being distracted all the time.
All right. From the very high point of view, to end this on the super practical. If anybody's listening to this right now and wonders, so how do I start this? You talked a lot about starting things and opportunities and things. What's your recommendation if somebody says, I want to try out a companion,
Well,
which seems to be a
they can
thing?
just ping us, I would say,
There you go.
and we'll send them something.
So we'll send Markdown files. If
We'll
you don't know
send.
what to,
I'm in all seriousness, I
yeah,
think both of us would be very happy. You could share your morning routine thing. We can share a lot of things
yeah,
that are at least a starting point to understand how this actually works.
there you go. So write to us if you're interested in this, if you want to try it out, and if you have opinions on this, and if you have more questions, we're happy to have this conversation, because these conversations between all of us are how we got where we are and how we continue to learn and experiment. And so, thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Thank you for making the time to listen to Follow the Rabbit. Please let us know your thoughts and suggestions by sending an email to ftr@knownunknowns.xyz. Like the episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, and most of all, share the episode with others who might find it interesting. It really helps us out. Thank you so much for listening in. Talk to you soon.